They called me mad for building walls thick enough to hold back winter itself. But my grandmother whispered secrets before she died, and the cold that was coming would not be satisfied with ordinary shelter. I remember the exact moment the mockery began. I was hauling river stones up the narrow mountain path, my back aching, my fingers raw from the weight of them, when 3 women from Thornwick passed me on their way to gather late autumn herbs. They stopped and stared at the pile of rocks I had already accumulated near my grandmother's cabin, at the clay I had mixed in great wooden barrels, at the moss I had stripped from the northern faces of ancient oaks. One of them, Marin, who had been something like a friend to me when we were children, covered her mouth to hide her smile. Another laughed openly. The third simply shook her head with that particular kind of pity that cuts deeper than any blade. "Let her play at Fortress," Marin said, loud enough for me to hear. "Perhaps she thinks the wolves will knock on her door asking for shelter." They laughed all the way down the path, their voices carrying through the trees long after they had disappeared from sight. I stood there with stone dust on my hands and shame burning in my chest, but I did not stop. I could not stop. Something older than my own understanding drove my hands, my aching muscles, my sleepless nights of mixing and mortaring and measuring. My grandmother had died in the spring, when the last snows were melting and the first crocuses were pushing through the frozen earth. She had been the village healer for 40 years, the keeper of herb lore and bone-setting wisdom, the one they called when children burned with fever, or when hunters returned with wounds too deep for ordinary care. They respected her, feared her a little, needed her constantly. But they never loved her, and they certainly never loved me. I was her strange granddaughter, the girl who preferred the company of trees to the company of other children, who wandered too far into the forest, who came back with stories of white shapes moving between the pines. My mother had died giving birth to me, and my father had disappeared into the mountains 3 days later, never to return. My grandmother raised me alone in this cabin at the edge of the world, teaching me the names of every plant that grew in the shadow of the peaks, every star that wheeled overhead in winter, every sign that the forest offered to those patient enough to read them. In her final hours, she had gripped my hand with surprising strength, her eyes fever-bright and fixed on something I could not see. She spoke of the old pact, the one made by our ancestors when the village was nothing but a handful of huts clinging to the mountainside. She spoke of the white wolves who guarded the sacred places, who kept the balance between the wild and the tame. She spoke of a winter that would come. Perhaps not this year, perhaps not the next, but soon, a winter cold enough to crack stone and freeze the hearts of the unprepared. "Build your walls," she had whispered, her breath rattling in her chest. "Build them thick and strong. When the Great Geada comes, they will need you. They will all need you, though they will never admit it until the cold forces them to their knees. And the wolves, Elara, the wolves will come too. You must be ready. You must be the bridge." I did not understand her words then. I am not certain I understand them now, even as I write them in the margins of her old journals, even as I trace the strange symbols she drew on the final pages. But I believe her. I believe her because I have seen the white shapes in the forest all my life. I believe her because the wind speaks to me in a language that has no words, but fills me with knowing. I believe her because when I press my palm against the ancient oak at the edge of our clearing, I feel a heartbeat that is not my own. The summer passed in a blur of labor. I reinforced the cabin's foundation with layers of river stone, filling the gaps with clay mixed with pine resin and animal hair. I doubled the thickness of every wall, creating a space between the inner and outer layers that I packed with dried moss, sheep's wool purchased from a grudging farmer, and bundles of last year's straw. The villagers watched from a distance, shaking their heads, whispering behind their hands. Some called me mad with grief. Others said the loneliness had turned my mind. The hunters who passed my clearing on their way to the deep woods looked at me with something between pity and contempt. Old Brennan, who had known my grandmother since they were both young, stopped by once in midsummer. He stood at the edge of my clearing and watched me work for a long while before speaking. "Your grandmother was wise," he said finally. But even she knew the difference between preparation and obsession. "You are building a fortress, girl. Against what enemy?" I did not answer him. How could I explain the dreams that woke me in the darkest hours, dreams of endless white, of cold so profound it seemed to have a voice, of wolves running through snow that reached their shoulders? How could I explain the feeling in my bones, the certainty that grew stronger with each passing day? "Against winter," I said at last, and he laughed, though not unkindly. "Winter comes every year," he said. "We survive it every year." "Not this winter," I wanted to say. "This winter will be different." But I held my tongue, and he eventually walked away, leaving me to my stones and my clay and my desperate, driven work. The autumn brought the first frosts, earlier than usual. The leaves turned gold and crimson and fell in great drifts that I gathered for additional insulation. I sealed every crack, every gap, every possible place where cold might creep through. I built a second door, creating a small vestibule between the outer world and my inner sanctuary. I gathered firewood until I had enough to burn for 3 months without rest, and then I gathered more. I dried meat and fish, preserved vegetables in salt and vinegar, stored grain in sealed containers lined with cedar to keep away the mice. The villagers' mockery grew sharper as the days shortened. Children threw stones at my shutters when they passed. Young men made crude jokes about the crazy woman on the mountain who thought she could outwit nature itself. Even Marin, who had once braided flowers into my hair when we were small, turned away when she saw me at the village market. Only the forest understood. The forest, and the white shapes that I glimpsed more frequently now as the world prepared for sleep. I would be gathering kindling at dusk, and I would feel eyes upon me, and I would turn to see a flash of pale fur disappearing between the trees. I would wake in the night to the sound of howling, not the ordinary howling of common wolves, but something older, something that seemed to carry meaning in its rising and falling notes. I would stand at my window in the gray light before dawn and watch a massive white wolf sitting at the edge of my clearing, watching my cabin with eyes that glowed like embers. The Alpha. I knew it was him, though I could not have said how I knew. He was larger than any wolf I had ever seen, his fur the color of fresh snow, a scar running across his muzzle that spoke of ancient battles. He never approached, never acknowledged me beyond that steady amber gaze. He simply watched, and then he was gone, melting into the forest like mist under morning sun. Sometimes there was a smaller wolf beside him, a female with gentler eyes and a coat touched with silver. She seemed less wary of me, lingering a moment longer before following the Alpha into the shadows. Once, I thought I saw her looking back at me, and I felt something pass between us, some recognition that transcended the barrier between our kinds. My grandmother had spoken of the wolves as guardians, as keepers of the old ways. She had spoken of a time long ago when the women of our line had walked freely among them, had understood their language, had shared in their sacred duty to protect the wild places from the encroachment of human fear and human greed. That bond had been broken somehow, she said, broken and nearly forgotten, but the blood remembers what the mind forgets. I did not know what that meant. I only knew that when I saw the wolves, I felt less alone. I felt connected to something larger than myself, something older than the village and its petty cruelties, something that had been waiting for me since before I was born. The first snow fell on the night of the autumn equinox, weeks earlier than it should have. I stood in my doorway and watched the flakes drifting down like whispered warnings, catching the light of my single candle before settling on the ground. By morning, the world was white, and the villagers were murmuring nervously about omens and portents. But the true cold had not yet come. I could feel it gathering in the north, building behind the peaks like a great beast preparing to spring. The birds knew it too. They fled south in enormous flocks that darkened the sky for hours, their cries urgent and afraid. The deer moved down from the high meadows. The bears sought their dens earlier than any living person could remember. Only the white wolves remained, their howls echoing through the frosted nights, their eyes gleaming in the shadows at the edge of my clearing. Waiting, as I was waiting. Preparing, as I was preparing. I spent those last weeks before the true winter checking and rechecking my preparations. I tested the seal on every window, reinforced the vestibule with another layer of stone, arranged my woodpile for maximum efficiency. I prepared my grandmother's old remedies, the ones for frostbite and fever and the terrible cough that could kill a strong man in 3 days. I did not know who I was preparing them for, but my hands moved with a certainty my mind did not share. The night before the Great Geada came, I dreamed of my grandmother. She stood in a grove of white birches, younger than I had ever known her, her dark hair unstreaked by gray, her eyes bright with a power I had only glimpsed in her final moments. The white wolves stood around her like a living court, the great alpha at her side, his scarred head level with her shoulder. "You are ready," she said. "But readiness is only the beginning. Courage is what you will need now, the courage to open what you have spent so long closing, the courage to trust what the world has taught you to fear." I tried to ask her what she meant, but the dream was fading, the birches dissolving into mist, the wolves disappearing one by one until only the alpha remained. He looked at me with those ancient amber eyes, and I felt the weight of generations in his gaze, the burden of secrets kept for centuries, the terrible loneliness of guardianship. Then he too was gone, and I woke to a silence so profound it seemed to press against my ears like a physical force. The air outside my window had changed. It was no longer merely cold, but something beyond cold, something that seemed to have substance and malice. When I breathed out, my breath hung in the air like a ghost before falling to the ground in tiny crystals. The water in my washing basin had frozen solid, despite being mere feet from the banked fire. The Great Geada had come. I spent that first day huddled by the fire, adding wood sparingly, watching the frost creep across the inside of my windows in patterns that seemed almost like writing. The wind howled around my cabin, testing every seal, probing every crack, but my walls held. The double layers of stone and clay and moss kept the killing cold at bay, trapping the heat of my fire in a cocoon of hard-won warmth. I thought of the villagers down in Thornwick, in their thin-walled houses with their inadequate woodpiles. I thought of the hunters who had laughed at me, who even now might be caught in the open, far from shelter. I thought of Marin, who had been kind once, who had forgotten that kindness when it became easier to mock than to understand. Let them laugh now, some dark part of me whispered. Let them see who was mad and who was wise. But I took no pleasure in the thought. I could only imagine the suffering that must be spreading through the village like the frost itself, the children crying with cold, the old ones struggling to breathe in the killing air, the fires that could not burn hot enough to push back the unnatural chill. The second day was worse. The temperature continued to drop, past any point I had experienced, past any point my grandmother had warned me about. Birds fell from the sky, frozen in mid-flight. I found a rabbit near my woodpile, caught by the cold as it ran for shelter, its body stiff as carved ice. The snow fell ceaselessly, not in gentle flakes but in sheets of bitter white that reduced visibility to mere feet. I could not see the forest. I could not see the clearing. I could see only the swirling wall of white and the relentless accumulation that was slowly burying my cabin like a grave. On the third day, I heard the howling. Not the muffled, distant howling I had grown accustomed to, but something close, something urgent, something that seemed to be calling directly to me. I pressed my face against the frost-covered window and tried to see through the blowing snow, but there was only white, endless and impenetrable. Then the howling stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else. A sound at my outer door, A scratching, weak and irregular, like something trying to get in but lacking the strength to persist. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it. Opening that door would let in the killing cold, would waste precious heat, would risk everything I had worked so hard to preserve. No one would blame me for staying safe in my fortress of stone and clay and moss. No one would even know. But my grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. The courage to open what you have spent so long closing. The courage to trust what the world has taught you to fear. I wrapped myself in every layer I owned. I covered my face with wool and my hands with double mittens. I took a deep breath of warm air, knowing it might be the last warmth I would feel for some time. And then I opened the door. The cold hit me like a physical blow, driving the breath from my lungs, burning every exposed inch of skin. Snow swirled into my vestibule, carried on a wind that screamed with the voice of the storm. I could see nothing at all, until I looked down. He lay on my threshold, half buried in snow, his white fur making him almost invisible against the drifts. The great Alpha, the scarred guardian, the leader of the sacred pack. His eyes were closed, his massive body still except for the faint, irregular rise and fall of his chest. Blood stained the snow beneath him, a spreading darkness that the storm was rapidly covering. Behind him, barely visible in the swirling white, I saw another shape. The smaller wolf, the silver female, standing guard over her fallen leader. Her eyes met mine through the storm, and in them I saw desperation and hope and something that might have been recognition. Help him, those eyes seemed to say. Please. You are the only one who can. I did not hesitate. I did not think about the cold rushing in, the heat rushing out, the careful preparations of months being undone in moments. I bent down and wrapped my arms around the Alpha's massive body, feeling the terrifying chill of his fur, the faint flutter of his heartbeat against my chest, and I dragged him inside, into the warmth I had built with my own 2 hands, into the refuge that the whole world had laughed at, into the walls thick enough to hold back winter itself. The silver wolf watched from the threshold for a long moment. Then she turned and disappeared into the storm, her howl rising above the wind like a promise. Or perhaps a warning. The weight of him nearly broke me. I had not understood, seeing him from a distance, just how massive the Alpha truly was. His body stretched across the floor of my vestibule like a fallen king, his white fur matted with blood and ice, his great paws larger than my spread hands. I could barely close the outer door against the wind that fought to keep it open, and when I finally managed to force it shut, the sudden silence rang in my ears like a bell. I stood there for a moment, gasping, my muscles burning from the effort of dragging him even those few feet. The cold had followed us in, a living presence that coiled around my ankles and crept up my spine. Already I could feel the temperature dropping in my carefully sealed home, the heat I had hoarded bleeding out through the door I had opened. But I could not leave him in the vestibule. The space between the 2 doors was meant to be a barrier, a buffer zone where the worst of the cold could be trapped before reaching my inner sanctuary. If I left him there, he would freeze, and all my courage would have been for nothing. So I opened the inner door and dragged him again, inch by agonizing inch, across the threshold and into the warmth of my home. His body left a trail of melting snow and dark blood on the wooden floor, a path that marked the impossible thing I was doing, bringing a wild wolf into my house, bringing the Alpha of the sacred pack into the shelter I had built for myself alone. My grandmother would have understood. My grandmother had walked among them once, had known their language, had shared their purpose. But my grandmother was dead, and I had only her whispered words and my own desperate instincts to guide me. I closed the inner door and leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire had burned low while I wrestled with the weight of him, and the cabin was colder than I had allowed it to become since the storm began. I forced myself to move, to add wood to the flames, to coax them back to crackling life. Then I turned to face the creature I had saved. He lay where I had left him, near the door, his massive body utterly still except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His eyes remained closed, his scarred muzzle resting on the floor, his legs sprawled at awkward angles that spoke of complete exhaustion. The blood that stained his white fur seemed to come from multiple wounds, some old and reopened, others fresh and still seeping. I knelt beside him, my hands trembling, and began to assess the damage as my grandmother had taught me. A deep gash across his shoulder, perhaps from another predator, perhaps from a hunter's blade. Smaller cuts on his legs and flanks. A wound on his side that looked like it might be from an arrow, though the shaft was gone, leaving only a ragged hole that oozed with each labored breath. And beneath all of it, the terrible cold that had sunk into his bones, the frost that rimmed his fur and crusted his eyelids. He was dying. I could see it in the shallow trembling of his body, in the blue tinge to the skin beneath his fur, in the way his breaths came further and further apart. The cold had nearly claimed him, and the wounds had done the rest. I should have felt afraid. This was no tame dog, no gentle creature raised to trust humans. This was a wild thing, a predator, a beast that could tear out my throat with a single snap of his jaws. If he woke while I was tending him, if instinct overcame whatever connection my grandmother had spoken of, I would die here in my fortress, killed by the very creature I had tried to save. But I felt no fear, only a strange, settled certainty that I was doing exactly what I was meant to do. The same certainty that had driven me to build my walls, to prepare my stores, to ignore the mockery of an entire village. The certainty that came from somewhere deeper than thought, older than memory. I gathered my grandmother's supplies, clean cloth for bandages, a poultice of yarrow and comfrey that she had taught me to make for wounds that would not close, a tea of willow bark and elderflower for fever and pain, warm water heated over the fire, a blanket of wool so old and worn that it was soft as cloud. Then I began to work. I had never touched a wolf before. I had seen them at a distance, had felt their eyes on me in the forest, had heard their songs in the darkness. But I had never been close enough to feel the texture of their fur, the heat of their bodies, the terrible strength contained in their limbs. The alpha's fur was coarser than I expected, thick and layered against the cold, but beneath it his skin was surprisingly soft, almost delicate. I could feel his ribs too clearly as I cleaned the wound on his side, could count the bones of his spine as I spread the poultice across his shoulder. He had been starving even before the storm. The realization struck me with unexpected force. The great guardian, the leader of the sacred pack, had been slowly wasting away while the village below lived in comfortable ignorance. I thought of the hunters who ventured into the forest each autumn, who returned with pelts and meat and stories of narrow escapes. I thought of the traps they set, the poisons they laid, the relentless war they waged against anything that competed for the game they considered theirs by right. Had they done this to him? Had they driven the pack from their hunting grounds, starved them slowly through the seasons, wounded them when they ventured too close to human territory? The thought filled me with a cold anger that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. But anger would not save him, only warmth and care and the stubborn refusal to let go. I worked through the night, barely aware of the passage of time. I cleaned each wound, applied poultices to the deepest cuts, wrapped bandages around his shoulder and side with strips torn from my own spare clothing. I heated stones in the fire and placed them around his body, covered him with blankets, lay beside him to share my own warmth when his shivering grew too violent. I dripped warm water mixed with honey into his mouth, watched his throat move as he swallowed reflexively, felt a spark of hope each time he took what I offered. Outside, the storm raged on, its voice a constant howl that formed the backdrop to my desperate work. The wind threw itself against my walls with renewed fury, as if angry that I had stolen its prey. The snow continued to fall, piling higher and higher, until I could no longer see out of my windows at all, only an endless white that pressed against the glass like a living thing. But my walls held. The walls they had laughed at. The walls they had called madness. The walls I had built with my own bleeding hands. They held against the cold that had killed everything caught in the open. They held for me, and they held for the wounded king who lay before my fire. Sometime before dawn, his shivering stopped. Not the stillness of death, but the quieter rest of a body finally warm enough to sleep. His breathing deepened, steadied, lost the terrible rattle that had frightened me through the long hours. When I placed my hand on his chest, I felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath my palm. I wept then, though I could not have said why. Perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from relief, perhaps from the overwhelming strangeness of it all, the wild impossibility of what I had done. I had saved him. Against all odds, against all reason, I had saved the alpha of the white wolves. I fell asleep beside him, too tired to move, too drained to care about propriety or safety. My hand rested on his fur, and my last thought before darkness claimed me was that this was the warmest I had felt since my grandmother died. I woke to amber eyes. He was watching me. The great alpha, the scarred guardian, was awake and watching me with an intensity that stopped my breath in my throat. His head was lifted from the floor, his ears pricked forward, his gaze fixed on my face with an expression I could not read. Not aggression, exactly, not fear. Something else, something that felt almost like wonder. I did not move. I barely breathed. Every instinct told me that this was the moment of truth, the point where everything would be decided. He could kill me now, with a single lunge, a single snap of those massive jaws. I was lying within easy reach, defenseless, vulnerable. If he saw me as a threat, if his wild nature overcame whatever connection my grandmother had spoken of, I would die before I could even scream. But he did not attack. He simply watched, those amber eyes studying me with an intelligence that seemed far beyond what any ordinary wolf should possess. I felt weighed, measured, judged by some standard I could not understand. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head back to the floor. Not in submission exactly, but in acceptance, in trust. I let out the breath I had been holding, and something released in my chest that I had not even realized was clenched tight. He was not going to hurt me. He understood what I had done for him, and he was choosing not to hurt me. For a long moment, we simply lay there, human and wolf, sharing the warmth of my fire, listening to the storm that still raged outside. I could feel the strangeness of it settling into my bones, the sense that I had crossed some invisible threshold and could never go back. My life before this moment seemed distant, unreal, like a story told about someone else. The mockery of the villagers, the loneliness of my years in this cabin, even my grandmother's death and the grief that had followed, all of it felt far away. There was only this impossible connection, this fragile trust being built between two creatures who should have been enemies. "I need to check your wounds," I said softly, my voice hoarse from disuse and exhaustion. I knew he could not understand my words, but I spoke them anyway, hoping that the tone would convey my meaning. "I am not going to hurt you. I am trying to help." He watched me rise, his eyes tracking my movements, but his body remaining still. When I knelt beside him and reached for the bandage on his shoulder, he flinched once but did not snap, did not growl, did not give any sign of aggression. He simply watched and waited and let me work. The wound looked better than I had feared. The poultice had done its job, drawing out the infection and beginning the slow process of healing. The cut on his side was still raw and angry, but the bleeding had stopped, and the flesh around it was clean. He would need time to recover fully, weeks perhaps, but he would recover. He would live. I changed the bandages, applied fresh poultice, offered him more water mixed with honey. He drank more eagerly this time, his tongue lapping at the liquid I poured slowly into a shallow bowl. When I offered him a strip of dried meat, he took it gently from my fingers, his teeth never touching my skin. "Good," I whispered. "Good boy. You are going to be all right." Something flickered in his eyes at my words, something that might have been amusement or might have been offense. I realized suddenly how foolish I sounded, speaking to the great alpha as if he were a puppy to be praised and petted. This was no tame creature, no pet to be coddled. This was a king in his own realm, a guardian whose bloodline stretched back centuries, a being far older and wilder than I could fully comprehend. "I am sorry," I said, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. "I do not mean to patronize you. I do not know how else to speak to you. I do not know your language." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I could have sworn I saw understanding in those amber depths. Then he sighed, a great exhale that stirred the fur around his muzzle, and closed his eyes. Not in dismissal, but in rest. In peace. I sat back on my heels and looked around my cabin, seeing it suddenly through new eyes. The fire crackling in the hearth, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the frost still etched across the windows, though it was thinner now, the storm outside finally beginning to ease. And in the middle of it all, a white wolf sleeping on my floor, his head resting on his paws, his great body rising and falling with each breath. "This is mad," I said aloud, to no one in particular. "This is absolutely mad." But I was smiling as I said it, and the smile felt unfamiliar on my face, like a garment I had not worn in a very long time. The storm lasted 3 more days. 3 days in which the world outside my windows remained a swirling white void, impenetrable and absolute. 3 days in which I lived with a wolf in my cabin, learning his rhythms, adapting to his presence, building something I could not name but could feel growing stronger with each passing hour. He slept much of the first day, his body working to heal the wounds that had brought him so close to death. I took the opportunity to rest as well, catching fragments of sleep between tending the fire and checking his bandages and preparing what food I could from my stores. The dried meat I had prepared seemed to be to his liking, as was the small amount of porridge I offered, though he looked at it with such disdain that I found myself apologizing for its blandness. By the second day, he was strong enough to lift his head and watch me move around the cabin. His eyes followed me everywhere, not with suspicion or threat, but with a kind of alert curiosity that made me feel both observed and protected. When I spoke to him, explaining what I was doing as I stoked the fire or prepared a meal, he listened with an attentiveness that seemed almost human. I began to tell him about myself, about my grandmother and her teachings, about the village and its cruelty, about the dreams that had driven me to build my fortress against the cold. I told him about the loneliness that had been my constant companion since I was old enough to understand that I was different, that I would never belong in the world of ordinary people. I told him about the white shapes I had seen in the forest, the feeling of being watched that was more comfort than threat, the sense that I was waiting for something I could not name. He listened to all of it, his amber eyes never leaving my face. And though he could not respond in words, I felt understood in a way I had never felt with another living being. He saw me. He heard me. He did not judge or mock or turn away. On the 3rd day, he tried to stand. I was across the room, measuring out herbs for another batch of healing tea, when I heard him grunt with effort and turned to see him struggling to his feet. His legs shook beneath him, weak from days of illness and injury. But there was determination in the set of his scarred jaw, a refusal to remain helpless that I recognized in myself. "Wait," I said, hurrying to his side. "You are not ready. You need more time." He ignored me, of course. He was the alpha, the leader of his pack. He did not take orders from anyone, least of all from the strange human woman who had dragged him in from the storm. He pushed himself upright, swayed dangerously, and took one unsteady step toward the door. I caught him as he fell, wrapping my arms around his neck, bracing my legs against the floor to take his weight. He was so heavy, so impossibly heavy. But I held him, and after a moment he leaned into me, accepting the support I offered. "Stubborn creature," I muttered into his fur. "You are as stubborn as I am." He made a sound then, a low rumble in his chest that might have been protest or might have been laughter. I chose to believe it was laughter. I helped him back down to the floor, to the nest of blankets I had arranged for him near the fire. He went reluctantly, his eyes fixed on the door with a longing that I understood too well. He wanted to be out there, in the forest, with his pack. He wanted to be free. Soon, I promised him. When the storm ends and you are stronger, I will not keep you here. I only ask that you let me finish healing you first. He looked at me then, and something passed between us, some silent agreement that transcended the barrier of language. He would stay. He would let me help him. And when he was ready, he would leave, and I would let him go. It was the hardest promise I had ever made. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. I woke to silence, true silence, and for a moment I thought I had gone deaf. Then I realized that the wind had stopped, that the constant howling that had been the backdrop of my life for nearly a week had finally, blessedly ceased. I rose from my bed and went to the window, rubbing away the frost with my sleeve. Outside, the world had been transformed. The snow lay in great drifts that reached halfway up my walls, glittering in the pale light of a sun I had not seen in days. The sky was a clear, empty blue, so bright it hurt my eyes. The trees that I could see were bowed under the weight of snow and ice, their branches drooping like the arms of exhausted dancers. It was beautiful, and terrible, and utterly, impossibly still. I looked back at the Alpha, who had raised his head and was watching me with those knowing amber eyes. "The storm is over," I told him. "The world is still there." He made that low rumbling sound again, and I could have sworn his scarred mouth curved in something like a smile. I bundled myself in every layer I owned and dug my way out through the snow that had piled against my door. The cold was still brutal, still far below anything I had ever experienced, but it was no longer the killing cold of the Great Geada. This was ordinary winter cold, survivable cold, the kind of cold that my village had weathered for generations. My village. The thought struck me like a blow. In my focus on the wounded wolf, in my desperate struggle to save one life, I had almost forgotten about the hundreds of lives below. What had happened to Thornwick during the storm? How many had survived? How many had frozen in their thin-walled houses, had starved when their inadequate stores ran out, had died alone in the killing dark? I had to know. I had to see. But I could not leave the Alpha alone. Not yet. He was stronger, yes, but still weak. Still healing. Still dependent on the warmth of my fire and the food I provided. As if reading my thoughts, he rose to his feet. Slowly, carefully, testing his weight on each leg before committing to it. This time he did not fall. This time he stood steady, his great head lifting, his amber eyes meeting mine with an expression that needed no translation. "Go," those eyes seemed to say. "Do what you must. I will be here when you return." I hesitated, torn between duty and fear, between the village that had rejected me and the wolf that had accepted me. Then I nodded, once, and turned toward the door. I was halfway down the mountain path, struggling through snow that reached my waist, when I heard the howling. Not from behind me, not from my cabin where the Alpha waited, but from ahead, from the forest. From the pack that had been out there through the entire storm, surviving somehow, waiting for their leader to return. And at the head of that chorus, clearer than all the rest, I heard the voice of the silver female, the smaller wolf who had led the Alpha to my door. She was calling to me, I realized, calling me forward, calling me home. I did not understand what that meant. I only knew that I could not ignore it. I changed direction, turning away from the village path, following the sound of howling into the frozen heart of the forest. The forest had never felt so alive, even buried beneath snow deep enough to swallow me whole. I struggled through the drifts, following the howling that rose and fell like a song without words, like a prayer spoken in a language older than human memory. My lungs burned with each breath of frozen air, and my legs ached with the effort of pushing through the endless white, but I did not stop. I could not stop. Something was pulling me forward, some thread of connection that had been waiting all my life to be followed. The silver wolf appeared between the trees like a ghost made flesh. She stood on a ridge above me, her pale fur gleaming in the winter sunlight, her amber eyes fixed on my struggling form. She was smaller than the alpha, more delicate in her proportions, but there was nothing fragile about the way she held herself. She radiated a quiet authority, a certainty of purpose that made me feel clumsy and uncertain by comparison. I stopped, knee-deep in snow, and looked up at her. My breath came in ragged gasps that hung in the air like clouds. "I am here," I said, though I did not know if she could understand me, did not know what I was even trying to say. "You called me. I came." She held my gaze for a long moment, those amber eyes seeming to look straight through to my soul. Then she turned and began to walk along the ridge, glancing back once to make sure I was following. I followed. The path she led me on was ancient. I could feel it in my bones. Though the snow covered everything, though there was no visible trail to mark the way, I sensed that countless feet had walked this route before me. Human feet and wolf paws alike, treading the same ground through centuries of seasons, maintaining a connection that most had long forgotten. My grandmother had walked this path. I was certain of it. Her mother before her and her mother before that, stretching back through generations to a time when the world was young and the bond between our kinds was unbroken. The silver wolf moved easily over the snow, her paws spreading wide to distribute her weight, barely sinking into the surface that swallowed me to mid-thigh. She waited patiently each time I fell behind, never showing frustration, never pushing me faster than I could manage. But there was urgency in the set of her ears, in the way her eyes kept scanning the forest around us, in the occasional low whine that escaped her throat. Something was wrong. Something beyond the storm, beyond the alpha's wounds, beyond the ordinary troubles of winter. I could feel it in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the cold, a sense of something building toward a crisis I did not yet understand. We walked for what felt like hours, though the sun barely moved in the winter sky. The forest grew older around us, the trees larger and more gnarled, their branches heavy with snow and age. I began to see symbols carved into some of the trunks, patterns that looked almost like the ones my grandmother had drawn in her journals. Runes of protection, she had called them. Runes of remembrance. Marks left by those who came before, guides for those who would come after. I traced one of the symbols with my frozen fingers, feeling a faint warmth beneath the bark, as if the tree itself remembered the hand that had carved it. My grandmother's hand, perhaps, or some ancestor whose name had been lost to time, but whose work endured. The silver wolf made an impatient sound, and I hurried to catch up with her. She led me through a narrow gap between two massive boulders, into a valley I had never seen before, never even suspected existed. The mountains rose on either side like walls, sheltering this hidden place from the worst of the wind. And at the far end of the valley, set into the face of a cliff like a wound in the stone, I saw the entrance to a cave. No, not just a cave. Something more. Something sacred. The opening was framed by pillars of natural stone, shaped over millennia by wind and water into forms that almost looked carved. Above the entrance, more symbols were etched into the rock, larger and more elaborate than any I had seen on the trees. They seemed to glow faintly in the winter light, pulsing with a soft luminescence that had no visible source. The silver wolf stopped at the entrance and turned to face me. Her eyes held mine, and in them I saw something that might have been hope, or might have been fear. This was the moment. I understood. This was why she had called me. Whatever lay inside that cave, whatever secret the pack had guarded for generations, she was offering to share it with me. I took a deep breath of frozen air and stepped forward into the darkness. The cave was warmer than I expected, the stone walls holding heat that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out shapes around me. More symbols on the walls, painted in colors that had faded with age, but still held echoes of their original vibrancy. Bones arranged in careful patterns on the floor, wolf and human intermingled, honored together in death as they had been bound in life. And at the center of the main chamber, a pool of water that should have been frozen, but was not, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the faint glow of the symbols above. I was not alone in the cave. As I moved deeper, I began to see them. Wolves, a dozen or more, lying in the shadows along the walls. Some were healthy, their coats gleaming, their eyes watchful. Others were thin and weak, their ribs showing through their fur, their breathing labored. All of them watched me with the same amber gaze, the same ancient intelligence, the same mixture of hope and wariness. The pack, the sacred guardians that my grandmother had spoken of. They had taken shelter here during the storm, in this place that their ancestors had used for countless generations. But something was wrong with them, something beyond the ordinary hardships of winter. They were sick, I realized. Not just hungry, not just cold, but genuinely ill with something that their wild strength could not overcome. The silver wolf moved past me, going to lie beside a young male whose breathing was shallow and uneven. She licked his face gently, a gesture of comfort and care that made my heart clench in my chest. He was dying. They were all dying, slowly, of something I could not see. I knelt beside the pool at the center of the chamber and looked down into its still surface. My own face looked back at me, pale and drawn, my dark hair escaping from beneath my woolen cap. But as I watched, the reflection began to change. The water rippled without being touched, and images formed in its depths. I saw the forest as it had been long ago, green and wild and teeming with life. I saw the wolves running through the trees, strong and numerous, their howls filling the night with music. I saw women walking among them, women with my grandmother's eyes, women who wore pendants of bone and silver around their necks and spoke a language that was half human words and half something else entirely. I saw the bond between them, the sacred pact that tied the fate of the wolves to the fate of the land itself. And then I saw what had happened to break that bond. Hunters coming with fire and steel, villages expanding into the forest, the old ways forgotten, the old languages lost. Generation after generation of guardians dying without passing on their knowledge, until only my grandmother remained, and then only me. The wolves had weakened as the bond weakened, their power fading as their human partners disappeared. They were tied to the land, and the land was tied to the guardians, and without that connection, both were slowly dying. The vision faded, and I was left staring at my own reflection, tears freezing on my cheeks. I understood now. I understood why my grandmother had insisted I build my walls, why she had spoken of the wolves coming to me, why she had called me the bridge. The pack was not just seeking shelter from the storm. They were seeking the last guardian, the last woman of the bloodline, the only one who could restore what had been broken. But how? I did not know the old language. I did not have my grandmother's training or her wisdom. I was just a woman who had built thick walls because her dying grandmother had told her to. A woman who had dragged a wounded wolf in from the cold because she could not bear to let him die. How could I possibly restore a bond that had been fraying for generations? The silver wolf rose and came to stand beside me, her shoulder pressing against my arm. She looked down at the pool, then back at me, and I felt her meaning as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. The water, the sacred pool, that was the key. I remembered suddenly something my grandmother had said, long ago when I was still a child. The old magic is not learned, Elara. It is remembered. It lives in the blood, in the bone, in the breath. You cannot study your way to it. You can only open yourself and let it come. I had not understood her then. I was not certain I understood her now. But I knew I had to try. I stripped off my gloves and plunged my hands into the pool. The water was warm, almost hot, and it tingled against my skin like electricity. I felt something stir in my chest, something that had been sleeping for years, waiting to be awakened. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their light pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The wolves around me lifted their heads, their amber eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was almost painful. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the sensation, the warmth spreading up my arms, into my shoulders, down my spine. The pulse of the symbols matching the pulse of my blood. The voices of the wolves, not howling now but humming. A low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then I heard it. The language my grandmother had spoken of. Not words exactly, but meaning, flowing into my mind like water into a vessel. I understood the wolves. I understood the forest. I understood the bond that had been broken and how it might be mended. The cure for their sickness was not medicine. It was connection. The guardians had been their anchor to the physical world, the conduit through which the power of the land flowed into them and through them. Without that anchor, they were slowly drifting away, losing their hold on life itself. To save them, I had to become what my grandmother had been. I had to accept the role that had been waiting for me since before I was born. I opened my eyes and lifted my hands from the pool. Water dripped from my fingers, glowing faintly with that same inner light. The silver wolf was watching me, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears if wolves could cry. "I understand," I said, and my voice sounded different, deeper, resonant with something that had not been there before. "I understand what I have to do." I turned to face the sick wolves, the dying wolves, the beautiful creatures who had held on through generations of neglect and abandonment, waiting for someone to remember them. One by one, I went to each of them. I knelt beside them and placed my wet hands on their fur, and I felt the connection snap into place like a key turning in a lock. The power of the pool flowed through me and into them, mending what had been torn, restoring what had been lost. It was exhausting. Each wolf I healed took something from me, some piece of my own energy that I gave willingly, but could not give without cost. By the time I reached the last of them, an old female with a gray muzzle and clouded eyes, I was trembling so badly I could barely stand. But I did stand, and I did heal her. And when it was done, when every wolf in that cave had been touched by the power that was my birthright, I collapsed beside the sacred pool and let the darkness take me. I dreamed of my grandmother. She stood beside the pool, young and strong, her dark hair unbound, her eyes full of love and sorrow. She reached out and touched my cheek, and her hand was warm, so warm. "You did well," she said, "better than I dared hope. The bond is restored, but it is fragile still. It will take time to strengthen. It will take care and courage and sacrifice." I tried to speak, to ask her the 1,000 questions that crowded my mind, but she shook her head gently. "Not yet," she said. "There is still work to be done. The Alpha waits for you, and there are others who will need your help before this winter ends. The village, Elara. The village that scorned you, that mocked you, that drove you into isolation. They are your people too, whether they know it or not. You cannot abandon them to the cold." "I do not know if I can forgive them," I said. and my voice was the voice of a child, small and hurt. "Forgiveness is not the same as trust," she said. "You do not have to trust them, but you do have to help them. That is what it means to be a guardian. We protect those who cannot protect themselves, even when they do not deserve it, even when they hate us for it." She began to fade, her form dissolving into light, and I reached for her, desperate to hold on to this one moment of connection. "Grandmother, wait. I have so many questions. I do not know how to do this. I do not know if I am strong enough." Her voice came from far away, from everywhere, from the very stones of the cave. "You have always been strong enough, Elara. You simply did not know it. Trust yourself. Trust the wolves. Trust the bond that binds you all together. And remember, the walls you built were never meant to keep the world out. They were meant to give you a place from which to welcome it in." I woke to the feeling of warm fur pressed against my side. The silver wolf had curled around me while I slept, her body heat keeping me from the chill of the cave floor. When I stirred, she lifted her head and looked at me with those knowing amber eyes, and I felt the bond between us like a golden thread stretching from my heart to hers. I reached out and touched her face, feeling the softness of her fur, the strength of the muscles beneath. "Thank you," I said, "for bringing me here, for trusting me, for not giving up on the bond even when everyone else had forgotten." She made a sound low in her throat, something between a whine and a purr, and pressed her nose against my palm. Around us, the other wolves were stirring. They looked different now, stronger, more vital. The sickness that had been draining them was gone, replaced by a fierce energy that seemed to crackle in the air around them. They came to me one by one, touching their noses to my hands, to my face, acknowledging the bond that now tied us together. It was humbling and terrifying and wonderful all at once. But I could not stay in the cave. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. "The Alpha waits for you, and there are others who will need your help." I rose to my feet, steadier now than I had been before I slept. The exhaustion was still there, a deep weariness that went all the way to my bones, but it was manageable. I had work to do. I could rest when it was finished. The silver wolf led me out of the cave, back into the winter afternoon. The sun was already starting its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. The other wolves followed behind us, a procession of white and silver and gray, their paws silent on the frozen ground. We did not return by the same path we had come. Instead, the silver wolf led me on a different route, one that curved around the shoulder of the mountain and descended toward the valley where Thornwick lay. As we walked, I began to smell smoke on the wind, not the clean smoke of hearth fires, but something darker, more acrid, the smoke of destruction. My pace quickened, my heart hammering in my chest. The wolves quickened with me, their bodies tense, their ears pricked forward. We crested a ridge, and there below us lay the village of my birth, or what remained of it. The Great Geada had not been kind to Thornwick. Half the buildings were dark and cold, their chimneys empty, their windows staring like dead eyes. Drifts of snow had piled against doors that would never open again, burying the houses and their frozen inhabitants alike. In the center of the village, a group of survivors had gathered around a bonfire built from broken furniture and torn-down fences. They huddled together for warmth, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. And at the edge of the village, a group of men stood with torches and weapons, facing outward toward the forest. Toward us. They had seen the wolves. I could hear their shouts of alarm, their calls to arm themselves, their curses against the beasts they blamed for their misfortune. They did not know that these wolves had nothing to do with their suffering. They did not know that the pack had been dying right alongside them, victims of the same broken bond. They only knew that they were afraid, and that fear needed a target. The silver wolf pressed against my leg, her growl vibrating through my body. The other wolves spread out behind us, their hackles raised, their teeth bared. They would fight if they had to. They would die to protect me, I realized. They would die because I had restored the bond, because I was their guardian now, because that was what the pact demanded. No, I said, and my voice rang out across the snow with an authority I did not know I possessed. There will be no fighting, not today. I stepped forward, away from the wolves, into the open space between the forest and the village. The men with torches saw me emerge from between the white bodies of the pack, and their shouts of alarm turned to gasps of shock. "The witch!" someone cried. "The mad woman from the mountain. She commands the wolves." I kept walking, my boots crunching on the frozen snow, my heart steady despite the fear that coiled in my stomach. When I was close enough to see their faces clearly, I stopped. "I am not a witch," I said. "I am Elara, granddaughter of the healer you came to when your children were sick and your bones were broken. I am the guardian of this forest and the wolves who protect it, and I am here to help you if you will let me." The men stared at me, their torches wavering, their weapons half raised. Behind me, I could feel the wolves waiting, watching, ready to spring at my command. But I would not give that command. My grandmother was right. These were my people, whether I liked it or not. And a guardian did not abandon her people, even when they had abandoned her. "Please," I said, and let them hear the truth in my voice. "Let me help." The silence that followed my words stretched like a held breath, fragile and trembling on the edge of violence. I could see the fear in their eyes, these men who had once passed my cabin with mockery on their lips. Fear of me now, fear of the wolves behind me, fear of a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far stranger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. It was old Brennan who broke the silence. He pushed through the line of armed men, his weathered face pale but determined, his eyes meeting mine with something that might have been recognition. He was thinner than I remembered, the storm having carved hollows in his cheeks, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I knew your grandmother," he said. "I knew her better than most. She healed my wife when the fever took half the village, 30 winters past. She saved my son when he fell through the ice on Miller's Pond. She never asked for more than we could give, and she never turned anyone away." He paused, his gaze flickering to the wolves that waited behind me, then back to my face. "If you are truly her granddaughter, if you truly have her gift, then we need you. Half the village is dead or dying. The cold took the old and the young first, and now sickness is spreading among those who survived. We have no healer. We have no hope. We have nothing but fear and the ashes of our arrogance." I felt something shift in my chest at his words. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. These people had scorned me, yes. They had called me mad, had thrown stones at my shutters, had made my life a lonely misery. But they had also suffered. They had lost children, parents, friends to the terrible cold I had predicted and they had refused to believe in. Their cruelty came from ignorance, and ignorance was not the same as malice. "I will help you," I said, "but the wolves stay with me. They are not your enemies. They never were. They are guardians, protectors of this land and everyone who lives on it. If you harm them, I will not be able to save you." The men shifted uneasily, their weapons still half raised, their torches still flickering in the wind. One of them, a younger hunter whose name I did not know, stepped forward with his jaw set in defiance. "Guardians," he spat. "They killed 3 of our sheep last autumn. They took Marcus's best hunting dog. They are monsters, and you are a fool if you think otherwise." The silver wolf growled low in her throat, and I felt her anger through the bond, hot and sharp. But I placed a hand on her head, calming her, and addressed the young hunter directly. "Your sheep wandered into their territory during mating season. Your hunting dog attacked a wolf pup and was killed defending it. These are wild creatures with their own laws, their own needs, their own right to exist. If you want to live alongside them in peace, you must learn to respect those boundaries. If you continue to see them only as monsters, you will never understand the truth of what they are. The hunter opened his mouth to argue, but Brennan silenced him with a sharp gesture. Enough, the old man said. We can debate wolf philosophy when we are not freezing to death. The woman has offered her help. I say we accept it. There were murmurs of agreement from some, continued suspicion from others. But the cold was a more pressing enemy than any wolf, and desperation is a powerful persuader. One by one, the weapons lowered. One by one, the torches were extinguished or used to light the way back to the central bonfire. I followed them into the village I had avoided for so long, the wolves trailing behind me like silver shadows. The survivors watched us pass with wide eyes, pulling their children close, pressing themselves against walls as if they could melt into the stone. I did not blame them for their fear. I only hoped that in time they would learn that fear was not necessary. The situation was worse than I had imagined. In the largest building still standing, what had once been the village hall, rows of makeshift beds held the sick and dying. Children burning with fever, old women coughing blood, men with blackened fingers and toes where frostbite had begun its terrible work. The smell of illness hung heavy in the air, mixed with smoke and despair. I set to work immediately, drawing on everything my grandmother had taught me. The herbs I had brought in my satchel, the ones I had prepared against just such a need, the techniques for reducing fever, for cleaning wounds, for saving limbs that the cold had tried to claim. The wolves waited outside, too large and too frightening to bring into the crowded hall, but I felt their presence through the bond, steady and reassuring. Hours passed. I moved from bed to bed, doing what I could, knowing it would not be enough for all of them. Some were too far gone, their spirits already loosening from their bodies, ready to fly free. For those, I could only offer comfort, a warm hand to hold, a gentle voice to ease their passing. But others, many others, still had a chance if I could work fast enough, if my supplies held out, if my strength did not fail. The villagers watched me work with expressions that shifted slowly from suspicion to something approaching awe. They had seen their own healers fail, had watched their loved ones slip away despite every remedy they knew. And here was the mad woman from the mountain, the one they had mocked and shunned, saving lives with hands that seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do. Marin found me near midnight, as I was grinding herbs by candlelight to make more of the fever-reducing tea. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her face pale, her hands twisting in her apron. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Elara," she said. I have to, my daughter. Please." I looked at her, this woman who had been my childhood friend, who had braided flowers in my hair and laughed at my jokes, and then abandoned me when it became easier to mock than to understand. She was gaunt now, aged by grief and terror, the pretty girl I remembered buried beneath layers of hardship. And in her eyes, I saw a mother's desperate love, the same love my own mother must have felt before she died giving me life. "Take me to her," I said. Marin's daughter was 7 years old, a small thing with tangled brown hair and a face that might have been beautiful if it were not so pale, so still. She lay in a cot in the corner of the hall, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin hot to the touch. Fever had her in its grip, and it was not letting go. I knelt beside the cot and placed my hands on the child's forehead, closing my eyes, reaching for the power that I had discovered in the sacred cave. It came reluctantly at first, weakened by hours of ordinary healing, stretched thin by the demands I had already placed on it. But I pushed deeper, drawing on reserves I did not know I had, and felt the warmth flow from my palms into the child's burning body. The fever fought me. It was strong, this sickness, stronger than any ordinary illness should be. There was something wrong about it, something that tasted of darkness and despair when I touched it with my newfound senses. This was not just a disease. This was connected to the same imbalance that had weakened the wolves, the same broken bond that had left the land vulnerable to forces that should never have gained a foothold. I pushed harder, pouring everything I had into the battle. The child's breathing steadied. Her fever began to break. Color returned to her cheeks, faint but present, a sign that life was winning against death. When I finally pulled my hands away, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. Maren caught me as I swayed, her arms strong despite her fear, her face wet with tears. "Thank you," she said, over and over. "Thank you. Thank you, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything." I wanted to tell her that sorry was not enough. I wanted to tell her that years of isolation and mockery could not be erased by a single moment of gratitude. But I was too tired. And her daughter was alive, and sometimes that had to be enough. "Rest now," I said to both of them. "She will need care in the coming days. But the worst is past. The fever will not return." I stumbled out of the hall and into the frozen night, desperately needing air that did not smell of sickness and death. The silver wolf was waiting for me, and she pressed against my legs as I leaned on her for support. Through our bond, I felt her concern, her love, her fierce pride in what I had accomplished. But we both knew the truth. I had saved many tonight, but I could not save everyone. And the sickness itself, the darkness I had tasted when I fought the fever, that was still out there, still growing, still threatening everything I was trying to protect. "The Alpha," I said aloud. "I need to get back to the Alpha." The silver wolf made a sound of agreement and began to lead me through the village, toward the path that wound up the mountain to my cabin. But we had barely reached the edge of the buildings when a figure stepped out of the shadows to block our way. He was tall and broad, with a hunter's build and a hunter's cold eyes. His name was Garrett, and he was the leader of the men who made their living tracking and killing the creatures of the forest. I had seen him many times over the years. Always at a distance, always with a chill of instinctive dislike. He was the one who set the traps, who laid the poisons, who had driven the wolves from their traditional hunting grounds and into the high mountains where prey was scarce and survival was hard. He was also, I realize now, the one who had wounded the Alpha. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low drawl that made my skin crawl. "The witch returns. I heard you were down here playing healer, saving the people who wanted nothing to do with you. Very noble. Very foolish." "Let me pass," I said, straightening despite my exhaustion, meeting his eyes with all the authority I could muster. "I have no quarrel with you, Garrett. Not tonight." He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "No quarrel? You stand there with wolves at your back and tell me you have no quarrel? Those beasts have cost me a fortune in pelts and bounties. They have made my life a misery for years. And now I find out they have a protector, a guardian who can heal them when I wound them, who can call them to her side like trained dogs. Oh, I have a quarrel with you, girl. A quarrel that ends only one way." The silver wolf growled, her hackles rising, her teeth bared. I felt the other wolves behind me, the ones who had followed me to the village, responding to her aggression with their own. The air crackled with tension, with the promise of violence barely contained. "You cannot win this fight," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my stomach. "There are a dozen wolves here, and I am their guardian. If you attack me, they will tear you apart before you can raise your weapon." Garrett smiled, and the expression was worse than his anger had been. "Do you think I came alone, girl? Do you think I am stupid enough to face a witch and her beasts without preparation?" He raised his hand, and from the shadows around us, other figures emerged. Hunters, a dozen of them, armed with bows and spears and the long knives they used for skinning their kills. They had been waiting, I realized. Waiting for me to exhaust myself healing the villagers. Waiting for the moment when I would be weakest. "Here is what is going to happen," Garrett said, stepping closer, his cold eyes never leaving mine. "You are going to come with us. Nice and quiet. The wolves are going to stay here. And we are going to have a long conversation about what you are and how you do what you do. When I am satisfied with your answers, maybe I will let you live. Maybe I will even let you go back to your little fortress on the mountain. But the wolves," he shook his head slowly, "the wolves are finished. Every last one of them." The silver wolf lunged at him, and everything happened at once. Arrows flew. Wolves leaped. Men screamed. Blood sprayed across the snow, red on white, vivid and terrible. I threw myself forward, not knowing what I intended to do, only knowing that I could not let this happen, could not let the pack be destroyed when I had just saved them, could not let everything I had sacrificed be for nothing. Something hit me from behind, a blow to the back of my head that sent stars exploding across my vision. I fell forward into the snow, felt rough hands grabbing my arms, heard Garrett's voice cutting through the chaos of battle. "Take her. Take her now, while the beasts are distracted. We will finish this somewhere the whole village is not watching." I struggled, but my body would not obey. The exhaustion, the blow to my head, the hours of healing that had drained me to the dregs. It was all too much. I felt myself being lifted, carried, dragged away from the sounds of fighting, away from the silver wolf's desperate howls. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was a flash of white in the trees above the village. A massive shape, scarred and fierce, watching from the ridge with amber eyes that blazed with fury. The Alpha. He had come. He had followed me down the mountain, despite his wounds, despite his weakness. And now he was watching as his pack fought and died, as his guardian was carried away into the night. I tried to call out to him, but no sound came. I tried to reach through the bond, but my strength was gone. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I knew nothing more. I woke to pain and cold and the smell of earth and stone. My head throbbed where I had been struck, and my wrists burned where rough rope had been tied too tight. I was lying on a dirt floor, in a space that felt enclosed and damp, lit only by the faint glow of a single lantern somewhere above me. A root cellar, I realized. One of the underground storage spaces the village used to keep vegetables through the winter. They had thrown me into a pit in the earth, bound me like an animal, left me alone in the dark. Not entirely alone. As my eyes adjusted, I saw Garrett sitting on a barrel near the ladder that led up and out. He was cleaning his knife with a piece of cloth, the blade catching the lantern light with each slow stroke. When he saw me looking at him, he smiled that cold, humorless smile. "Welcome back," he said. "I was starting to think I had hit you too hard. That would have been disappointing. There are so many questions I want to ask you before you die." I tried to sit up, but the ropes held me awkwardly, and my body was too weak to fight them. "Where are the wolves?" I demanded. "What happened to the pack?" His smile widened. "Some dead, some fled. Your little silver bitch took an arrow in the shoulder, but she managed to escape into the forest with a few others. As for the big one, the Alpha," he shook his head slowly. "He never came down from his ridge. Just watched. Watched his pack get slaughtered, watched you get taken, and did nothing. Some guardian he is." The words hit me like physical blows. The silver wolf, wounded, others dead. And the Alpha, watching but not acting. I did not understand. He had been fierce, protective, determined to lead his pack despite his injuries. Why would he stand by while everything fell apart? Unless he could not. Unless he was still too weak, too wounded, too far from the healed state I had thought he had achieved. I had left him in my cabin, had assumed he would continue to recover in the warmth I had provided. But he had followed me instead, pushing his battered body far beyond what it could safely endure. And now, when his pack needed him most, he had nothing left to give. This was my fault. All of it. I had tried to help too many, spread myself too thin, left the one who mattered most vulnerable and alone. Tears burned in my eyes, but I would not let them fall. Not in front of this man. Not when showing weakness would only give him satisfaction. "What do you want?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Why keep me alive at all?" Garrett leaned forward, his cold eyes bright with something that might have been curiosity, might have been greed. "Because you are valuable, girl. What you can do, healing the sick, commanding the wolves, that is not ordinary village herbcraft. That is real power. Old power. The kind of power men have searched for and killed for throughout history. I want to know where it comes from. I want to know how to take it for myself." I stared at him, understanding dawning cold and terrible in my mind. He did not just want to destroy the wolves. He did not just want to eliminate the threat I represented. He wanted what I had. He wanted the Guardian's gift, the bond with the land and its creatures, the ancient magic that my grandmother had passed down through generations, and he was willing to do anything to get it. "You cannot take it," I said, and I heard my grandmother's voice in the words, steady and certain. "It is not something that can be stolen or bought or beaten out of me. It is in my blood. It has been in my family's blood for 1,000 years. You could torture me for the rest of my life, and all you would get is my screams." Garrett's smile did not waver. "We will see about that," he said. "We have all winter, after all, and I am a very patient man." He rose from his barrel and climbed the ladder, taking the lantern with him. The cellar door slammed shut above me, plunging me into absolute darkness. I lay there in the cold and the black, listening to my own ragged breathing, feeling the bonds cutting into my wrists, wondering if this was how it would end. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in a hole in the ground, at the mercy of a man who had no mercy to give. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I felt something else. A warmth in my chest, faint but persistent. A thread of connection that stretched through the darkness, through the earth, through the miles of frozen forest. The bond. The bond I had forged with the wolves in the sacred cave. It was still there, still holding, still linking me to every creature I had touched with my power, including the Alpha. I closed my eyes and reached along that golden thread, pouring everything I had left into a single desperate message. Not words, but feeling, fear and hope and determination. A plea for help wrapped in an apology for leaving him, for thinking I could do this alone, for being too proud and too stubborn to ask for what I needed. And from somewhere far away, through layers of pain and exhaustion and the terrible weight of failure, I felt him answer. He was coming. Despite his wounds. Despite his weakness. Despite every reason he had to abandon me as the village had abandoned me so many times before. The Alpha was coming, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. Time moves strangely in absolute darkness. Minutes stretch into hours, hours compress into heartbeats, and all the while the cold seeps deeper into your bones, whispering that this is where you will die. This is where your story ends, in a hole in the earth with no one to mourn you and no one to remember your name. But I was not alone. Even in the blackest depths of that cellar, I held onto the thread of connection that linked me to the Alpha. I felt him moving through the forest, each step a victory against the pain of his wounds and the weakness of his body. I felt his determination, iron-hard and unwavering, driving him forward when any ordinary creature would have collapsed. He was coming for me. He was coming, and nothing in this world or any other would stop him. I do not know how many hours passed before I heard the first sounds of commotion above. Shouts, at first distant, then closer. The thunder of running feet. And beneath it all, rising like a storm given voice, the howling of wolves. Not just one wolf, not just a handful of survivors. A chorus of voices, dozens of them, filling the night with a sound that was part war cry and part lament and part something else entirely. Something that spoke of ancient power awakening, of a bond restored, of guardians returning to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The cellar door burst open and lantern light flooded down, blinding me after so long in darkness. I heard Garrett cursing, heard the scrape of his boots on the ladder, felt his rough hands grabbing my arms and hauling me upward. He dragged me out of the cellar and into a night transformed. The village was surrounded. Wolves lined the ridges, their pale forms ghostly against the snow, their amber eyes blazing with reflected firelight. More wolves than I had ever seen, more than I had known existed. They had come from the mountains, from the deep forests, from places so remote that humans had never set foot there. They had heard the call of their restored guardian, had felt the bond snap back into place after generations of silence, and they had answered. At their head, standing on the ridge closest to the village center, was the Alpha. He was magnificent. Despite his wounds, despite the bandages that still wrapped his shoulder and side, he stood tall and proud, his white fur gleaming like fresh snow, his scarred face lifted toward the sky. The silver wolf stood beside him, an arrow wound visible on her shoulder, but her stance fierce and unbroken. And around them, spreading out in perfect formation, the pack waited for their leader's command. Garrett's hand tightened on my arm, his knife pressing against my throat. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with a fear he could not hide. "Stay back, or I will kill her. I swear to all the gods, I will cut her throat before you can take a single step." The wolves did not move, the Alpha did not move, but I felt his attention focus on me, felt his presence wrap around me like a warm cloak, felt the question he was asking without words. I was tired. I was hurt. My wrists were raw from the ropes, my head still throbbed from the blow that had felled me, and every muscle in my body ached with exhaustion. But I was also angry. Angry at Garrett for his cruelty, angry at myself for being captured, angry at all the years of isolation and mockery and misunderstanding that had led to this moment. And beneath the anger, deeper than the pain, I felt the power that was my birthright. The power of the guardian, the bridge between worlds, the one who stood at the meeting place of human and wild. It had been drained by hours of healing, weakened by the blow to my head and the cold of the cellar, but it was still there. And I was done being afraid. "You will not kill me," I said, my voice steady despite the knife at my throat. "You need me. You said so yourself. I am valuable." Garrett's laugh was high and nervous. "I am starting to think you are more trouble than you are worth." "Perhaps," I said. "But let me tell you what is going to happen now. You are going to let me go. You are going to drop that knife and step away, and then you are going to run, as far and as fast as your legs will carry you, and you are never going to come back to this valley again." "And why would I do that?" he snarled. I smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Because if you do not, I am going to let them have you." I reached through the bond, not to the Alpha alone, but to every wolf on those ridges, every amber eye watching from the darkness. I showed them Garrett, showed them what he had done to their brothers and sisters over the years, the traps and the poisons and the merciless hunting. I showed them his cruelty, his greed, his absolute lack of remorse for the suffering he had caused. And I felt their response. A wave of fury so intense it nearly knocked me off my feet. A collective growl that rose from dozens of throats, building and building until the very air seemed to vibrate with their rage. Garrett felt it too. I saw his face go pale, saw his hand tremble against my throat, saw the moment he realized that he was not facing ordinary wolves. These were something older, something more, something that would not stop until justice was done. "Please," he whispered, and all his bravado was gone, replaced by the naked terror of a man facing his own death. Please, I did not. I was only. I pulled away from him, and he let me go, too frightened to hold on. The knife fell from his nerveless fingers into the snow. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting from wolf to wolf, searching for escape and finding none. "Run," I said. "Run now. I will hold them back long enough for you to reach the forest. What happens after that is between you and them." He ran. He ran like a man possessed, his boots slipping on the frozen ground, his breath coming in ragged sobs. The wolves watched him go, their bodies tense, their instincts screaming to give chase. But they held. They held because I asked them to, because the bond gave me that power, because even now, even after everything, I could not bring myself to order a man's death. He disappeared into the darkness between the trees, and the night swallowed him whole. Perhaps he would escape. Perhaps he would find his way to some distant village, some place where the wolves did not reach, and live out the rest of his days haunted by the memory of this night. Or perhaps the cold would claim him, or the mountains would break him, or the very forest he had spent his life exploiting would finally take its revenge. I did not care. He was gone, and I was free, and the wolves were singing their victory to the winter stars. The alpha came down from the ridge. He moved slowly, carefully, his wounds still hampering him despite the fierce energy that had driven him here. The other wolves parted before him, making way for their leader, their guardian, their king. When he reached me, he stopped, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other. He was beautiful, even scarred, even wounded, even exhausted from the impossible journey he had made to save me. He was the most beautiful creature I had ever seen. His amber eyes held depths I was only beginning to understand, wisdom accumulated over years I could not fathom, love so fierce it took my breath away. I reached out and placed my hand on his scarred muzzle, feeling the warmth of his breath, the softness of his fur, the steady pulse of life beneath my palm. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for not giving up on me." He made that low sound in his chest, the one I had come to understand as his version of laughter or perhaps of reassurance. Then he pressed his great head against my shoulder, and I wrapped my arms around his neck, and we stood there in the snow while the wolves howled around us and the villagers watched in terrified wonder. The days that followed were unlike anything the valley had ever known. The wolves did not leave. They settled into the forest around the village, hunting the deer that had grown too numerous, keeping watch over the paths that led to the outside world. At first, the villagers were terrified. They barred their doors at night, kept their children close, spoke in whispers about the witch who had called down this plague upon them. But winter was not over, and the cold was still bitter, and slowly, reluctantly, they began to see the truth. The wolves were not hunting them. The wolves were protecting them. When a group of bandits tried to take advantage of the village's weakened state, the pack drove them off before they could do any harm. When an avalanche threatened the main road, the wolves warned the travelers in time to save their lives. When the last stores of food began to run low, the pack brought deer to the village edge, leaving the carcasses like offerings at the threshold of a temple. I moved between two worlds during those weeks. I spent my days in the village, tending to the sick who still needed care, teaching some of the younger women the basics of herb craft, beginning the slow process of rebuilding trust that my grandmother had spent her whole life nurturing. And I spent my nights in the cabin on the mountain, with the alpha resting by my fire and the silver wolf keeping watch at my door. His wounds healed, slowly but steadily. The cut on his shoulder closed, leaving only a thin line of scar tissue beneath his fur. The deeper wound on his side took longer, but it too mended, flesh knitting together, strength returning to muscles that had wasted during his long illness. He began to move more easily, to eat more eagerly, to spend longer hours awake and alert. And as he healed, Our bond deepened. I learned to read his expressions, to interpret the subtle shifts in his posture, to understand the language of his eyes and ears and tail. He learned my rhythms too, anticipating my needs before I voiced them, offering comfort when I was sad and celebration when I was glad. We did not need words. We had something better, something older, something that transcended the barrier between our kinds. One night, near the end of winter, I sat by the fire with my grandmother's journal open on my lap, reading the passages she had written about the old pact, about the guardians who had come before me. The Alpha lay beside me, his great head resting on my thigh, his amber eyes watching the flames dance. "She wrote about you," I said aloud, not sure if he could understand the words, but knowing he would feel the meaning through our bond. Or about your ancestors, at least. She wrote about a time when the bond was strong, when guardians walked freely with the pack, when humans and wolves worked together to protect the balance of the wild. She said it was beautiful. She said it was the way things were meant to be. He rumbled deep in his chest, and I felt his affirmation through our connection. Yes. That was how it had been. That was how it could be again. I set the journal aside and ran my fingers through his thick fur. "I want to restore that," I said. "Not just the healing I did in the cave, but all of it. The full bond, the way it was in the old days. I want to be the guardian my grandmother believed I could be." He lifted his head and looked at me, those amber eyes searching my face with an intensity that made my heart race. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet and walked to the door. He looked back at me once, a clear invitation, and pushed through into the night. I followed him. Across the snow-covered clearing, into the forest, along paths that I was beginning to know as well as I knew the lines on my own palms. The silver wolf joined us as we walked, falling into step on my other side, her presence warm and reassuring. Other wolves appeared from the shadows, the pack gathering around their leader and their guardian, all of us moving together toward some destination I could not see but could feel pulling at my heart. We climbed higher than I had ever been, past the sacred cave, past the ancient trees, up into the realm of stone and ice where the mountains touched the sky. The air grew thin and sharp, the cold biting at my exposed skin, but I did not falter. The wolves surrounded me, their bodies a living wall against the wind, their warmth sustaining me when my own heat was not enough. At last we reached the summit. A flat expanse of rock swept clean of snow by the wind, ringed by peaks that glittered with ice under the light of a full moon. In the center of that natural amphitheater stood a single standing stone, weathered by countless centuries, carved with symbols that I recognized from the sacred cave and from my grandmother's journals. The gathering place, the heart of the old pact, the spot where, generation after generation, Guardian and Alpha had renewed the bond that tied their fates together. The pack arranged themselves in a circle around the stone, sitting on their haunches, their breath misting in the frozen air. The Alpha led me to the stone's base and stopped, looking at me with an expression that asked a question I did not know how to answer. "I do not know the ritual," I admitted. "My grandmother died before she could teach me. I only know fragments, pieces from her journals, echoes of what was supposed to be." He stepped closer to me, pressing his shoulder against my hip, and I felt knowledge flowing through our bond. Not words, but images. Memories passed down through generations of Alphas, preserved in the blood even when the human guardians had forgotten. I saw what needed to be done. I understood at last what it meant to truly take up my grandmother's mantle. I knelt before the standing stone and placed both hands against its frozen surface. The symbols beneath my palms began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, pulsing with the same rhythm I had felt in the sacred pool. The wolves lifted their voices in a howl that was also a prayer, a song that had not been sung in living memory but that their spirits still remembered. The Alpha stood before me, and I met his amber gaze without fear. I speak for the human world, I said, and the words came from somewhere deeper than memory, rising up through blood and bone to fill my throat. I speak for those who build and till and dream. I offer my service as guardian, as bridge, as keeper of the old ways. I pledge my life to the protection of this land and all who dwell within it. The Alpha responded, not in words, but in a pulse of intention that I translated through our bond. I speak for the wild world. I speak for those who hunt and howl and run free. I accept your service. I offer mine in return. Together we will guard the balance. Together we will keep the pact. The light from the stone blazed suddenly, blindingly bright, and I felt something click into place deep within my soul. The bond that had been fragile, tentative, a thread easily broken, became something stronger, a rope, a chain, an unbreakable connection that wove through every fiber of my being and tied me to the Alpha, to the pack, to the land itself. I gasped at the intensity of it, at the flood of sensation and emotion and knowledge that poured through me. I felt every wolf on that mountain, felt their hearts beating in time with mine, felt their joy and their relief and their fierce protective love. I felt the forest below us, the trees and streams and creatures great and small, all of them part of a web of life that I could now perceive as clearly as I perceived the stone beneath my hands. And I felt the Alpha, not as a separate being but as an extension of myself, his strength becoming my strength, his wisdom becoming my wisdom, his ancient heart beating beside my younger one in perfect synchrony. When the light faded and I could see again, the world had changed. Or perhaps I had changed and could finally see the world as it truly was. The wolves were watching me with something like reverence, their amber eyes reflecting the moonlight, their breath rising in silver clouds. The Alpha stood before me, and when I looked at him, I saw not just a wolf but a king, a guardian, a partner who would walk beside me for as long as we both lived. "It is done," I said, and my voice sounded different, deeper, resonant with the power that now flowed through me. "The pact is renewed." He pressed his scarred muzzle against my palm, and I felt his agreement, his satisfaction, his love. Then he turned and led the way back down the mountain, back toward the world we were sworn to protect. Spring came early that year. The snows melted, the rivers ran full. The first flowers pushed through the thawing earth with a vigor that surprised everyone. The villagers emerged from their long winter of fear and loss, blinking in the sunlight, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what the Great Geada had destroyed. I helped them. I healed their lingering illnesses, taught them the herbcraft my grandmother had taught me, advised them on crops and livestock and the 1,000 small decisions that determined whether a community thrived or withered. They were wary of me still, some of them. They whispered behind their hands, made signs against evil when they thought I was not looking, kept their children at a distance when I passed. But others remembered the night I had saved them. Marin became something like a friend again, her daughter now strong and healthy, her gratitude sincere even if her understanding was incomplete. Old Brennan spoke up for me at village meetings, reminding everyone that my grandmother had served them faithfully for decades, that I was continuing her work, that the wolves who now roamed the forests had not harmed a single villager since the pact was renewed. Slowly, season by season, the fear began to fade. Children grew bold enough to approach the edge of the forest, to catch glimpses of pale fur between the trees, to wave at the silver wolf when she appeared on the ridge above the village. Farmers learned to leave offerings at certain stones, small tributes that acknowledged the balance between their world and the wild. Hunters learned new rules, taking only what was needed, respecting the territories the pack had claimed, finding that the forest yielded more generously when it was treated with care. And I, who had once been the mad woman on the mountain, the laughingstock of an entire village, found my place at last. Not quite one of them, but not separate either. A bridge, as my grandmother had said, a keeper of the balance, a guardian who stood at the meeting place of two worlds and worked to ensure that both could flourish. The Alpha stayed with me, not every day, not every night, but often enough that my cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. He would arrive at dusk, pushing through my door with that lordly confidence, settling by my fire as if he owned the place. We would sit together in comfortable silence, or I would read to him from my grandmother's journals, or we would simply exist in each other's presence, the bond between us a constant warmth that needed no words to sustain it. One evening, near midsummer, I sat on the ridge above my cabin and watched the sun set over the valley below. The village was a scatter of lights in the gathering dusk, hearth fires and candles pushing back the darkness. Beyond it, the forest stretched in endless waves of green, teeming with life I could feel through my bond with the land. And beside me sat the Alpha, his white fur turned gold by the dying light, his amber eyes reflecting the colors of the sky. They laughed at my walls, I said, remembering that long ago autumn when I had struggled up the mountain path with river stones in my arms. They called me mad for building so thick and strong. He made that rumbling sound in his chest, the one that might have been laughter. They do not laugh anymore, I said. And my walls, they kept you warm when the cold would have killed you. They gave us a chance to find each other, to restore what had been broken. He leaned against me, his shoulder solid and warm, his presence a comfort I had never known I needed until I had it. Through our bond, I felt his gratitude, his love, his absolute certainty that we had found our way to exactly where we were meant to be. I wrapped my arm around his neck and rested my head against his fur, watching the last light fade from the sky, listening to the first wolves begin their evening song. In the village below, no one ran for cover at the sound anymore. They had learned that the howling was not a threat, but a promise, a reminder that the wild was still there, still strong, still watching over them even when they could not see it. My grandmother had been right about everything. The walls I built were never meant to keep the world out. They were meant to give me a place from which to welcome it in. A sanctuary where a wounded king could heal. A home where a lonely woman could find her purpose. A bridge between two worlds that had been separated for too long. The pack laughed at her thick walls. The old stories would say someday, passed down through generations who would remember this winter and its wonders, until they kept the Alpha warm at 40 below. And I would smile when I heard those stories, knowing that they captured only a fragment of the truth. The walls had kept him warm, yes, but what they had really done, what truly mattered, was give us both a chance to learn that the strongest fortifications are not the ones that keep others out. They are the ones that give us the courage to let them in.